everybody. It's Dr. Regina Bradley, and this is Outkasted Conversations, number 22. And I got with me one of the originals, the OGs in hip-hop scholarship, Dr. Joe Schloss. What's going on, good sir? How you?
Hey, I'm doing good. How are you?
Doing good. So for the folks who might not be familiar with why you're one of the OGs in hip-hop scholarship, tell them, some of your research and the books that you got out.
Okay, well, I've been interested in hip hop for a long time. I got into hip hop in like 1987 as a fan. Started studying it, I think, in a more formal capacity around 92, 93 as a scholar. I'm an ethnomusicologist by training, so that was when I was in grad school. I wrote my master's thesis in 95, which nobody knows about freestyling. I think I was the first person to write about freestyling in an academic capacity. It's not very good, but it exists, so I want the credit for that.
Right. Take the
credit. Then I finished my dissertation in 2000, which became a book called Making Beats, the Art of Sample-Based Hip-Hop, which was a participant observation ethnographic study of the sample-based hip-hop producers community. Which was a very kind of insular community. That's why I was interested in it. Like everybody by that point was listening to hip hop. Everybody like knew what the beat sounded like. But I think even people that were into hip hop didn't really know the whole process behind it. The sort of deep aesthetic process and thinking that went into the way people went about actually making beats. So. I basically hung out with a lot of producers for like 10 years and talked to them about how they thought about what they were doing. And I'm a really staunch advocate of ethnography in hip-hop scholarship. In other words, actually hanging out with people in the community rather than sort of sitting in an office somewhere and listening to a record or something like that. I mean, I think that is also a valid approach if you're studying records as records. In other words, if what you're studying is popular music, and you're studying it in the context of popular music, then listening to it in a kind of distanced way is the way it's meant to be listened to. So I don't have a problem with that in principle, but I think one of the things that hasn't been pursued as much as it could be is actually looking at the way these things operate culturally within certain very specific communities. So anyway, that's my sort of explanation for why I spend so much time just hanging out with hip-hop producers. Also because I'm just really into hip-hop production records. I connected with producers on that level because they're basically nerds for the most part, really into musical details and putting them together and everything. That was one of the things that really fascinated me about it. And it was an aspect of hip-hop that nobody was really talking about at that time. In other words, that, there's this whole gangster image and everything that has been with hip-hop from the beginning, and there's validity to that. That's certainly a part of it. But there are a lot of other roles that exist in hip-hop, particularly in terms of its musicianship, that are much more kind of philosophical and abstract and nerdy, basically, and they would call themselves nerds at that time. And they weren't marginal to hip hop. In other words, they weren't just like, oh, there are these nerds that are kind of sitting around the outside of hip hop, but that people with this kind of very meticulous scholarly approach to listening and to music making and to connecting listening to music making were at the heart of hip hop and still are. So that was something that I thought was really interesting that wasn't really being talked about. That's why I studied it for my dissertation, and I turned it into this book, Making Beats, the Art of Sample-Based Hip-Hop. And then my second book was called Foundation, B-Boys, B-Girls, and Hip-Hop Culture in New York. I felt that one of the things that wasn't really being talked about enough when people talk about hip-hop is the relationship between music and dance. And dance, everybody knows dance is really important to hip-hop and just physicality in the body and all these things, but people tended to talk about it in a very abstract way, which I thought was kind of a missed opportunity since there are these whole communities of hip-hop dancers that are very eloquent about the connection between music and dance and think about it on a very practical level every day. So I went to pretty much every major b-boy event in New York City between 2003 and 2008. And interviewed a lot of people and hung out and learned to break myself to some degree, to as much as a I think I started when I was 35, so I was like about 40 at the point where things really took off. As much as a 40-year-old college professor can actually, learn b-boying, I tried to do that because I felt like there are a lot of things that in any case, there are a lot of things you learn by doing that you can't learn just by observing or by asking questions. All of those things are important, but if you want to learn how people think about what they do, it's very, very useful to kind of try to do it yourself, because you realize the obstacles that you come up against and how people have dealt with those obstacles and so forth in a way that you wouldn't if you didn't try it yourself. So that book came out in 2009 and talks about hip-hop dance as well, and so I'm proud of that book as well. So that's neat.
The OG, Joe. That's why you one of the OGs. You just head first everything. But so I can't really ask you the inaugural question at Outkasted Conversations because we got to keep it 100. You're not exactly outcasted, and that's cool. But I mean, like, why don't you tell us about that a little bit?
Okay, so I want to clarify that a little bit. That's true. I'm not going to deny that. And it's kind of interesting, when we started talking about doing this, it sort of made me go back and think, because I have nothing against Outkast. I appreciate what they do. I respect what they do a lot. I enjoy what they do. But I think partially it was at the time that they really came out. It didn't really resonate with me. And I think that probably says more about me than it does about them, which may or may not be useful to people that are watching this. I don't know. But I was coming from very much an northeastern perspective on hip-hop. I think a lot of the things that I related to in hip-hop, particularly the samples, and especially, so I'm obsessed with New York City. Both my parents are from New York. I grew up in Connecticut. So I had this sort of suburban experience of growing up in this really, really boring small town, knowing that all this exciting stuff was going on in New York, like 100 miles away. So I've always been totally obsessed with New York City. So when hip-hop came out, one of the big appeals of it for me was its New York centrism. And I, in retrospect, I was like I was laughably biased in that regard. Like, there was a time when I wouldn't even listen to hip-hop from New Jersey, because I was like, no, hip-hop is supposed to be from New York. I'm not interested in that other stuff.
You're what they call like a purist? Yeah.
I would say I want to be careful about that, because I think that's true, but I think that's only part of it, because I think there's an issue with being a white person in hip-hop. Purism overlaps with that a lot, because it's a way for you to get a foothold into the community. It's like the standard first step that any white person takes. This is in my experience. Any white person that becomes interested in black culture, sort of the first phase of that is to be like, I'm going to be the blackest white person ever. You know what I mean? Therefore, that makes me more down than every other white person that's ever gone down the same path. And I mean, I laugh at it now because it's like way in my rearview mirror. But the truth is, I was as bad as anybody was in that regard. I mean, and I think it's natural, and it ties into a lot of I think the way African American culture has been positioned in America, which is like, there is this deep, pure, essentialist African American culture, and I'm going to find it. I'm not interested in this, which is total nonsense, of course. But coming from a white perspective, I think there's some very troubling aspects about that, and I'm certainly not immune to that, especially when I was younger. But I'm sure there's still elements of that in my thinking, which is like to kind of create this frame around black culture and have this kind of archaeological approach to it, where it's like, I'm going to find the real thing. As if you have any right to make those kinds of distinctions in the first place, but you don't even think about that. You take it for granted that such a thing exists, and that's what you're interested in. So, it's basically the standard issue kind of hipster attitude of like, I only want the most authentic thing because I'm curating my own life, and I want people to see that I understand phenomenon X better than anybody else. So anyway, I certainly went through that phase when I was in my early 20s, and then hopefully through critical thinking moved past that quickly. But so that I say all that to say, I think the purism aspect was part of it, and I think that my whiteness was part of the purism aspect. However, I also think there were other aspects to that, because I say that because I'm thinking of it like if I was watching this, my first instinct, if I saw somebody say what I just said, would be like, well, of course you're a purist, you're a white person, that's why you couldn't deal with Outkast. It didn't fit your conceptions of what blackness was supposed to be, or something like that. And so I want to acknowledge that. And I want to admit that there probably is some legitimacy if somebody's thinking that, but I don't think that's the whole story in my case. Because the New York thing is also just a personal thing for me, and part of what appealed to New York. Number one, part of what appealed to me about hip hop was the New York thing because of New York, not just because of the blackness, or because of what New York represented in terms of blackness, but just because of what New York represented to me personally. You know, in terms of the specific references and everything. So there was that. I mean, just the specificity of what they were doing with regard to Atlanta and Georgia generally. I just didn't know any of that stuff. So as a result, I was like, I can't relate to that. So I mean, I think that was part of it, and there was no animosity on my part about that. I was just like, this isn't for me. So there was that. The other thing was, I think, stylistically, they came around at a point where I was still in the mode of feeling the need to defend hip-hop, because it was still relatively new at that point. I mean, you know, hip-hop started, depending on which mythology you follow, it would say, you know, officially 73, most people would say, or 74. But, you know, in the early 70s, hit recordings around 1979. So, I mean, hip-hop as a form of recorded music was less than 15 years old at that point. Which the older I get, the younger that seems. You know what I mean? So, and as a mainstream thing, even in that 15-year period, it was still pretty much underground until, you know, the early 90s. So, I mean, it wasn't even being played on black radio. That's, you know, half of Public Enemy's songs were about, like, why doesn't hip-hop ever get played on black radio? And people forget that now. It was a very marginal culture and marginal musical form up until the early 90s. So I say all that to say, this goes back to the purism thing, I think. I was skeptical of experimental approaches to making hip-hop because I felt like they were implicitly apologizing for the way hip-hop was made.
So, you know, when you're talking about, you know, the connections between sampling and the story, I mean, like, one of the things I really liked about making beats that helps me in my own work is that it helps folks to understand that the actual production of the beat itself is a story within its own right. And what that means, and you know, what that means sonically in terms of how, I guess, the lyrics are complementing with an E, this, you know, the accompaniment and vice versa. Which makes me think about, you know, Organized Noize, who was Outkast's original production team, and the way that they created these kind of unique stories. Do you think that, I guess their influences were like funk and soul and stuff like that? Do you think that has something to do with the discomfort in terms of the way that they fit into the hip-hop scene at that time, when a lot of influences could be heard from jazz and all that good stuff, spoken word?
Yeah, definitely. I think there are a couple different threads that I could pick up on from what you said. One was part. I think what made me think a little bit differently about them was I saw Good Job, I think, before I saw Outkast live, and they were amazing live. I mean, they were just like one of the best live bands I've ever seen. And I think that's the issue with hip-hop still is to this day, which is that, I think a lot of people would say, even if they're skeptical about using live instrumentation in recordings, people are still more comfortable with using live instruments in a performance situation. And that, I think, is a connection to funk and to soul music. Because when you see hip-hop in a live setting, first of all, the musicians themselves are usually soul musicians, but also just sort of the whole performance aesthetic, the way people go about performing. So, for example, having the band come first and ramp, and then having the MCs come up on stage afterwards, like in this classic James Brown thing or whatever. Just the whole way that people go about it, I draw from these deep African-American performance traditions and funk and soul specifically. So I think that's clearly there, and so I think you're right. I think it's an alternative path to the same place. In other words, that I feel Judge and Family and those groups are coming out of a performance tradition. Like, in other words, the hip hop that I was listening to came out of relationship to the tradition of recorded soul and funk music, and I think that the Southern tradition comes more in relationship to the performance tradition of funk music. But they still come out they're both different types of relationships in the same tradition. Why? I don't know. But so I'm comfortable with the continuity of both of those relationships. I actually think for most people the continuity of that relationship is more apparent in Southern hip hop, or in particular. That's again one of the reasons why I'm so offensive about sampling. I think it's for people to see those connections. Because I guess one way to think about it for me is that. Like Outkast kind of skipped a step in the process. I can't say whether that's good or bad. You could say they skipped a step, or you could say they leapfrogged to the next stage. Because what happened was, hip hop developed out of listenership, and I think that's something people don't appreciate. A lot of the people that I talked to for making beats said, I'm not a musician. Somebody that's really, really good at listening to music. Or one of the people I talked to, DJ Cool, said, I play music, I play records as a DJ. And I use that title of the chapter because I think that's a really deep comment on the hip-hop aesthetic. In other words, people say, hip-hop DJs and producers aren't really musicians. And one level, I would argue with that, but on another level, a lot of DJs and producers would say that. They're basically say, I'm a curator of recordings, and I'm making music out of the process of curating the recordings proper. I don't think that's what Outkast is doing. And so that's what's interesting. I think they're more to make original music. But I mean, I think they have a similar mentality in the sense that they're, in both cases, they're doing it having knowledge of previous musicians. But that's what all musicians do. So in a sense, and maybe this is why I was resistant at first, but I've come to appreciate it later on. That they were skipping the stage of sort of a curated, curating recordings directly to the music making process. And I still have a little bit of hesitation in the sense that, as with anything, you probably lose some things by doing that stage, and also probably gain some things by not get sucked into it. So, I would be interested, honest. I would be interested to see what their record collections are. Because I think that would, if they have a substantial record collection, I think that would tell a lot. Like, I don't know, maybe you know this as studies more deeply, what they listen to, if they have variations in record collectors, I don't know. But it would not surprise me if you went to either houses and found 5,000 records in their living room. If that was in fact the case, which I suspect it is, it would tell me a lot.
I mean, I think that's really dope too. That's an alternative way of thinking about the significance of Outkast in hip hop is what they did in terms of the actual listening practice of what to listen for when thinking about hip hop, which is something that I might have to give a little bit more thought. I never thought about that actual, the act of listening as curating what is considered to be the Southern hip hop experience or anything like that. That's dope, Joe. That's why you my dude.
But to me, that's the essence of what hip hop is active listening, is hearing, and that's what got me into it. Sorry to interrupt. You're getting me hyped up. The reason I wrote my first book, or the reason I decided to do this dissertation, is I was at this picnic with all these producers, and they were arguing about where snare came from. Like, they were literally, I forget what the song was, but it was some hip song, and they were like, it was one snare hit, boom. And they were like, yeah, that definitely came from that record. Somebody was like, no, it was this other record. And they argued about it for like 10 minutes, and I was like, these guys are nuts. Like, the way that they listen, that they can recognize, they can hear somebody sing a snare drum once and feel like, I know what record that came from. It suggests an attitude towards listening that is really different than the regular way people listen to pop music. And I just found that totally fascinating. And I did because it's really nerdy. And so for me personally, I feel lost if I feel like people aren't that when they're in hip hop. But who am I to say what people should do? That's just my opinion. They're free to do whatever they want.
No, I think that's grounds for like making beats too. Right? Like that actual, the differences in listening in terms of those who are doing the actual production of the beats compared to those who are consuming them, which is really, really dope. But okay, so we could go on and on about this because we have these conversations all the time. But how can folks get in touch with you? And one more time about when the 10th anniversary is dropping for making beats.
Okay. It is sometime in the fall. We're not really sure yet. Officially, it dropped in November, but it might come a little bit earlier. I'm on Twitter as Joe.Schloss, Joe.Schloss. And I'm still putting together my website. It's not yet, but hopefully within the next few weeks we'll be able to contact me, and that is josephschloss.
Dope. So appreciate you for giving us a little bit of time and
thank you.
New ideas in the ear. Yeah, no doubt. I'm Dr. Regina Bradley. This is Outkasted Conversations. We'll holler at y'all next week. Y'all be easy.